For centuries, Slavs have dominated the vast landscapes of Central and Eastern Europe, shaping cultures, building nations, and leaving an undeniable mark on history. But beneath their proud identity lies a question that has sparked debates for generations. Do Slavs carry Mongolian DNA? It's a mystery that has fascinated historians, geneticists, and even the Slavs themselves. Could the Mongol Empire, once the most powerful force on Earth, have left a biological imprint on the people it ruled? Or is this just a myth born from centuries of conquest and cultural exchange? The answer isn't as simple as you might think. To truly understand the Slavic genetic legacy, we have to go back in time, to an era when Mongol warriors rode across the steppes, bringing terror and transformation to the lands they conquered. The Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus in the 13th century was nothing short of catastrophic. Cities were burned to the ground, entire populations were wiped out, and for nearly 250 years, the Mongols, through the Golden Horde, ruled over much of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. But ruling a people and mixing with them are two very different things. When we look at the genetic evidence, something fascinating emerges. DNA studies show that the core Slavic genetic pool remains overwhelmingly European, particularly linked to Indo-European ancestry. The majority of Slavs, especially West and South Slavs, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians, have virtually no trace of Mongolian genetic markers. Their DNA reflects a history deeply rooted in Central and Southeastern Europe, shaped more by migration, trade, and neighboring European groups than by the Mongol conquests. But what about East Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, who lived under Mongol rule for centuries? This is where things get more complex. Some regions of Russia, particularly in the north and northeast, do show minor traces of Y chromosome haplogroup N, which is more common in Siberian and Mongolic populations. However, this doesn't necessarily mean direct Mongol ancestry. In fact, most of this genetic influence likely comes from Finno-Ugric and Siberian groups that lived in the region long before the Mongols arrived. The real impact of Mongol rule on Slavic DNA appears to be much smaller than people assume. So why does the myth persist? One reason is the visible cultural influence the Mongols had on Slavic lands. The Mongols left behind political structures, military tactics, and even linguistic elements that can still be seen today. The Russian language, for example, contains words of Mongol origin, and elements of Mongol governance influenced the structure of the Russian state. But genetic influence? That's a different story. The reality is that while the Mongol Empire changed history, it did not fundamentally change the genetic makeup of Slavs. So, do Slavs have Mongolian DNA? The answer is largely no. While some regions of Russia show minor traces of Siberian and Central Asian ancestry, the overall genetic identity of Slavs remains firmly rooted in their European past. The Mongols shaped Slavic history, but they did not rewrite Slavic DNA. For centuries, the Mongol Empire was a force unlike any other, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. But despite its military dominance, its genetic footprint among the Slavic people remains surprisingly small. Why is that? If the Mongols ruled over Slavic lands for centuries, wouldn't their DNA have mixed into the Slavic gene pool? The answer reveals a fascinating story about conquest, culture, and survival. One of the biggest misconceptions about history is that conquest always leads to large-scale genetic mixing. But history shows us that this isn't always the case. The Mongols, for all their power, were a relatively small population compared to the millions of Slavs they ruled over. They didn't settle in large numbers, and instead, they governed from a distance, using local Slavic princes as intermediaries. Unlike other invading groups in history, the Mongols did not encourage widespread intermarriage with the local population. Instead, they maintained a clear distinction between themselves and the people they conquered. But that doesn't mean there was no genetic exchange at all. Some Mongol soldiers and administrators did settle in Slavic lands, and intermarriage did occur in some cases, particularly in regions closer to Central Asia. However, the numbers were too small to leave a lasting genetic imprint. Even in areas where Mongol influence was strongest, such as parts of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the dominant genetic markers remain overwhelmingly Slavic and European. Another factor to consider is time. The Mongol rule over Slavic lands lasted for about 250 years, but by the late 15th century, the Mongols had lost control. As Slavic states like Muscovy rose to power and expelled Mongol forces, any minor genetic influence they may have left behind became diluted over generations. Unlike Turkic and Central Asian populations, who share a much stronger genetic connection to the Mongols, the Slavs remained largely distinct. Genetic studies back this up. While certain regions of Russia show small traces of Y chromosome haplogroup N, which is associated with Siberian and Central Asian ancestry, this marker is far more common among Finno-Ugric and Turkic peoples than among Slavs. The vast majority of Slavic Y DNA belongs to haplogroups R1A and I2, which are of European origin and have been present in the region for thousands of years. Even mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, shows that Slavic ancestry is overwhelmingly European. In the end, the idea that Mongol rule drastically altered Slavic DNA is more myth than reality. The Mongols shaped Slavic history in profound ways, influencing everything from government structures to military tactics, but their genetic impact was minimal. Slavs remained, for the most part, genetically distinct from their Mongol rulers. For centuries, the Mongol Empire cast a long shadow over Slavic lands, ruling vast territories and reshaping the political landscape. But despite this deep historical connection, the genetic link between Slavs and Mongols is surprisingly weak. If the Mongols control parts of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus for generations, why don't Slavs today have significant Mongolian DNA? The answer lies in the way the Mongols ruled and how the Slavic populations responded to their presence. Unlike other conquerors who integrated with local populations, the Mongols took a different approach. They didn't settle in large numbers across Slavic lands, nor did they encourage intermarriage. Instead, they ruled through a system known as indirect governance. Local Slavic princes were allowed to maintain their positions as long as they paid tribute and remained loyal to the Mongol rulers. This arrangement meant that Mongols remained a relatively small ruling elite, separate from the general population. Even the famous Golden Horde, which controlled large parts of present-day Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, did not function like a traditional empire. Rather than colonizing Slavic lands, the Mongols preferred to use them for resource extraction, taxation, and military recruitment. Over time, many Mongols who did settle in the region assimilated not into Slavic society, but into Turkic-speaking populations, blending into groups like the Tatars and Bashkirs rather than the Slavs. However, some genetic influence did occur, particularly in the easternmost regions of European Russia. Certain Russian populations, especially in areas close to the Volga River and the Ural Mountains, show minor traces of East Asian ancestry. Studies of Y chromosome DNA, passed down through the paternal line, have identified small percentages of haplogroup C2, which is associated with Mongol and Central Asian ancestry. But the frequency of this haplogroup in Slavic populations is extremely low, often less than 2 to 3%, and is largely absent in West and South Slavic groups like Poles, Czechs, Serbs, and Bulgarians. This low genetic impact is in stark contrast to other regions under Mongol control. In Central Asia and parts of China, Mongolian genetic influence is far more pronounced, with significant portions of population carrying direct Mongol lineage. The difference: in those regions, Mongols settled in larger numbers, intermarried widely, and left behind a lasting genetic imprint. Ultimately, the reason Slavs have so little Mongolian DNA comes down to two key factors: the Mongols' administrative style and the resilience of the Slavic populations. Unlike other parts of the Mongol Empire, Slavic lands were not fully integrated into Mongol society, but were instead ruled from a distance. And as soon as Mongol power declined, Slavic states, especially Muscovy, quickly reasserted control, further limiting any lasting genetic impact. The Mongol invasion of the 13th century was one of the most devastating events in Slavic history. Entire cities were burned, populations were massacred, and the once powerful Kievan Rus was shattered. But despite this overwhelming military dominance, the Mongols never truly became part of Slavic society. Unlike in Central Asia or Persia, where Mongol conquerors left a significant genetic mark, their influence on the Slavic gene pool remained minimal. Why? Because their rule was built on power, not assimilation. The Mongols established what historians call the Tatar yoke, a period of Mongol dominance over Russian principalities, lasting nearly 250 years. However, they didn't govern directly. Instead, they relied on Slavic rulers to collect taxes, enforce laws, and keep order. The Mongols extracted wealth and manpower, but had little interest in permanently settling in Slavic lands. They lived in separate military encampments, maintained their nomadic way of life, and only a small number intermarried with local populations. For the Slavs, Mongol rule was not a cultural or demographic takeover. It was an occupation. The Mongols primarily demanded submission, tribute, and soldiers for their wars, rather than trying to integrate with the local population. Even when they recruited Slavic warriors into their armies, they remained distinct from the Mongol ruling class. This separation meant that while the Mongols left an undeniable impact on Slavic politics, military strategies, and even language, their genetic influence was remarkably small. Genetic studies support this. Y chromosome haplogroup N, which is common in parts of Russia, is sometimes mistaken for a Mongol marker. In reality, it has deep Siberian and Finno-Ugric roots, predating the Mongol invasion by thousands of years. Meanwhile, the signature Mongol haplogroup C2, associated with Genghis Khan's direct descendants, is almost entirely absent in Slavic populations. This tells us that, despite centuries of Mongol rule, the genetic footprint of the invaders barely remains. Even after the Mongols were driven out, their legacy persisted in other ways. The Russian state adopted Mongol administrative structures, military organization, and even elements of their diplomatic system. But genetically, the Slavs remained largely unchanged. Unlike in Central Asia, where Mongol conquerors merged with the local population, Slavic lands experienced Mongol rule as a political domination rather than a demographic transformation. For centuries, myths and misconceptions have surrounded the idea that Slavic people might have significant Mongolian ancestry. This belief is often fueled by historical accounts of the Mongol invasion, cultural exchanges, and even certain facial features observed in some Slavic populations. But when we turn to hard scientific evidence, genetic studies, historical records, and population data, the truth becomes much clearer. The reality is that while the Mongols undoubtedly influenced Slavic history, their genetic imprint is far less significant than commonly assumed. One of the biggest misconceptions comes from a misunderstanding of Y DNA haplogroups. Haplogroup C2, often associated with Genghis Khan and his descendants, is a key marker of Mongolian ancestry. This lineage is widespread in Mongolia, parts of China, and Central Asia. However, in Slavic populations, this haplogroup is almost entirely absent. This means that even though Mongols ruled over parts of Eastern Europe for nearly 250 years, they did not leave a major genetic mark. Instead, the dominant Y DNA haplogroups in Slavic populations are R1A and I2, both of which have been in Europe for thousands of years, long before the Mongol invasion. Another source of confusion is the presence of haplogroup N, which is common in northern Russia. Some mistakenly associate this with Mongol ancestry, but in reality, it has Siberian and Finno-Ugric origins. This haplogroup was present in the region long before the Mongols arrived and is more closely linked to ancient Uralic-speaking peoples than to the Mongol Empire. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, tells a similar story. Studies of Slavic maternal lineages show continuity with prehistoric European populations, with no sudden influx of East Asian maternal markers during or after the Mongol rule. This further confirms that while some Mongols may have intermarried with locals, these cases were rare and did not significantly alter the overall gene pool of Slavic populations. The idea that Slavs have Mongolian DNA often stems from visible traits such as high cheekbones or slightly almond-shaped eyes, which some people associate with Asian ancestry. However, these features are not exclusive to Mongolian populations. Similar traits can be found in Northern and Eastern European groups due to ancient genetic interactions with Finno-Ugric peoples, Arctic populations, and even Neolithic hunter-gatherers who once lived in the region. This means that physical appearance alone is not a reliable indicator of Mongolian ancestry. The historical relationship between Slavs and Mongols was one of conquest and resistance, not integration and intermarriage. While the Mongols left a deep impact on Slavic politics, military tactics, and even language, their genetic influence remains almost negligible. The overwhelming majority of modern Slavs descend from European ancestors who lived in the region long before the Mongols ever set foot in Eastern Europe. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe in the 13th century was one of the most devastating military campaigns in history. The Golden Horde, a powerful Mongol faction, controlled vast territories, including parts of present-day Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, for over 2 centuries. Given this prolonged dominance, it's easy to assume that the Mongols left a deep genetic imprint on the local Slavic populations. However, when we analyze historical migration patterns and genetic evidence, the reality is far more nuanced. The Mongol strategy in Eastern Europe was not one of settlement, but of military control and economic exploitation. Unlike in China or Persia, where Mongols assimilated into local populations, they remained largely separate from Slavs. The Mongol elite ruled from fortified encampments and extracted tribute through local princes, maintaining a strict ruling class rather than integrating through widespread intermarriage. This means that while the Mongols had an undeniable cultural and political influence, their genetic contribution was minimal. Another key factor is the demographic structure of the Mongol forces in Eastern Europe. The armies of the Golden Horde were not purely Mongol, but consisted largely of Turkic and other nomadic steppe tribes. These included Kipchaks, Cumans, and Tatars, many of whom already had historical ties to Eastern Europe before the Mongol expansion. Over time, these groups mixed with local populations, but their genetic impact was distinct from that of the Mongols themselves. This is why modern-day Tatars, who were once part of the Mongol political system, have some East Asian genetic markers, while most Slavs do not. One of the strongest arguments against significant Mongol genetic influence in Slavic populations is the absence of Mongolic language elements in Slavic dialects. When a population undergoes large-scale genetic mixing, linguistic influences usually follow. However, Slavic languages retain only a handful of Mongolic loanwords, mostly related to military and administrative terms. This suggests that cultural exchange was far greater than any genetic intermingling. Even in Russia, where Mongol rule was longest and most intense, genetic studies show that ethnic Russians share far more genetic affinity with other Europeans than with Central Asian or Mongolic populations. The dominant haplogroups in Russia, R1a, N1c, and I2, are of European and Uralic origin, with only trace amounts of Mongolic-associated haplogroups like C2. If Mongol rule had resulted in significant genetic mixing, we would expect to see much higher levels of East Asian mitochondrial DNA in Slavic populations. But studies have consistently shown that Slavic maternal lineages remain overwhelmingly European. This confirms that despite centuries of political dominance, the Mongols did not significantly alter the genetic makeup of Slavic peoples. In conclusion, while Mongol rule shaped the course of Slavic history, introducing new political systems, military tactics, and even economic structures, their genetic footprint is surprisingly small. The Mongols were conquerors, not settlers, and their lasting influence on Slavic populations was cultural rather than biological. The Y chromosome, which is passed down exclusively from father to son, is a key genetic marker in tracing paternal ancestry. If the Mongols had left a significant genetic imprint on Slavic populations, we would expect to see high frequencies of haplogroup C2, a lineage strongly associated with Mongolic and other East Asian populations. However, genetic studies reveal a different reality. In Eastern and Western Slavic populations, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Czechs, and Slovaks, the dominant Y chromosome haplogroups are 1a and I2, both of which are of European origin. Haplogroup C2, while common in Mongolic and Turkic populations of Central Asia, is found at extremely low frequencies among Slavs, typically ranging from 1% to 3%. This is a strong indication that despite Mongol rule over parts of Eastern Europe, direct paternal genetic influence remained minimal. The presence of haplogroup N1c in some Russian and Belarusian populations is often mistaken for Mongol ancestry. However, This lineage is actually of Uralic origin, associated with Finno-Ugric-speaking peoples, such as the Karelians and Komi. The spread of N1C into Slavic populations likely resulted from interactions with Uralic groups in the north, rather than any significant Mongolic genetic contribution. One of the most fascinating genetic studies in this area focuses on the so-called Genghis Khan haplotype, a specific subclade of C2, M217, which is believed to have originated from Genghis Khan and his descendants. This lineage is widespread across Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and parts of China, but is nearly absent among Slavic populations. If Mongol forces had intermarried extensively with Slavic women, this paternal lineage would be far more prevalent in Eastern Europe today. Another important factor to consider is the nature of Mongol rule in Russia and surrounding Slavic lands. The Mongols imposed their dominance through vassalage and tribute collection rather than large-scale settlement. Unlike in China or Persia, where Mongol rulers and soldiers married into local elites, the Golden Horde's leadership maintained a clear ethnic and social distinction from the Slavic populations under their control. This separation further limited any potential genetic exchange. Moreover, historical records indicate that Slavic nobility and commoners alike viewed the Mongols as foreign rulers rather than integrated partners. While some Russian princes paid tribute and collaborated with the Mongols for political survival, large-scale intermarriage was neither encouraged nor widespread. The lack of Mongol surnames or family lineages in Slavic aristocracy further supports this historical divide. In summary, the Y chromosome evidence overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that Mongolic paternal ancestry is virtually non-existent in Slavic populations. While there are trace amounts of East Asian Y DNA in some areas, these likely stem from interactions with Turkic nomads or earlier migrations rather than direct Mongol influence. The Mongols shaped the history and culture of Eastern Europe, but their genetic legacy in the Slavic world remains remarkably small. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, is inherited exclusively from the mother, making it an essential tool for tracing maternal ancestry. If Mongol women had significantly contributed to the Slavic gene pool, we would expect to find a notable presence of East Asian mtDNA haplogroups, such as D, C, A, and G, which are prevalent in Mongolic and other Northeast Asian populations. However, genetic studies reveal a different picture. Among Slavic populations, including Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Czechs, and Serbs, the dominant mtDNA haplogroups belong to European lineages such as H, U, J, and T. East Asian maternal lineages appear only in trace amounts, generally below 1%. Even in regions historically influenced by Mongol rule, such as Central and Southern Russia, the frequency of East Asian mtDNA remains exceptionally low. This suggests that despite centuries of Mongol presence in Eastern Europe, intermarriage between Mongol women and Slavic men was extremely rare. The few East Asian maternal haplogroups detected in Slavic populations are more commonly found in Siberian and Uralic groups, such as the Nenets and Evenks, rather than in core Mongolic populations. This indicates that any Asian maternal ancestry in Slavs is more likely due to interactions with indigenous Siberian or Turkic groups rather than a direct Mongol contribution. Historical factors further support this genetic evidence. The Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe was primarily a military campaign, not a migration of families. Unlike their conquests in China and Persia, where Mongol rulers established dynasties and assimilated with the local populations, the Golden Horde largely maintained a distinct, separate identity from the Slavic peoples under their control. Mongol women rarely accompanied warriors on campaigns, and there are no historical records of large-scale Mongol female settlement in Slavic lands. Additionally, cultural and religious barriers would have further limited intermarriage. The Mongols followed shamanistic and later Islamic traditions, while the Slavs adhered to Orthodox Christianity. Mixed marriages were uncommon and not widely accepted within either society. Even the Mongol rulers who controlled Russian principalities through tribute systems did not integrate into Slavic noble families in any significant way. One of the strongest arguments against a substantial Mongol maternal influence is the absence of a noticeable East Asian genetic footprint in modern Slavic facial features and phenotypes. While minor Asian traits can be observed in some individuals, they are far more common in populations with significant historical Mongol or Turkic admixture, such as the Kazakhs and Tatars. Slavs, by contrast, overwhelmingly exhibit European phenotypic characteristics, further confirming the limited genetic impact of Mongol maternal ancestry. In conclusion, mitochondrial DNA analysis strongly indicates that Mongol women did not significantly contribute to the Slavic gene pool. While small traces of East Asian maternal lineages exist, they are rare and more likely originate from interactions with Siberian and Uralic groups rather than direct Mongol ancestry. The Mongol presence in Eastern Europe was politically and militarily influential, but genetically, its impact on Slavic maternal lineages was minimal. The Y chromosome is passed down exclusively through the paternal line, making it a key genetic marker for tracing male ancestry. If Mongol men had intermingled extensively with Slavic populations, we would expect to see a significant presence of Y chromosome haplogroups commonly associated with Mongolic and East Asian populations, such as haplogroup C2, M217, which is widely found among Mongols and other groups of the Eurasian steppe. However, genetic studies show that this is not the case. In Slavic populations, the dominant Y-DNA haplogroups are R1a, I2, and N1c. Haplogroup R1a, particularly the R1a Z282 branch, is the most widespread among West and East Slavs, with frequencies ranging from 40% to over 60% in some regions. This haplogroup is of Indo-European origin and has been present in Eastern Europe for thousands of years, long before the Mongol invasion. Haplogroup I2 is more prevalent among South Slavs, particularly in the Balkans, and is linked to ancient European populations. Meanwhile, haplogroup N1c, which is found in some northern Slavs, has connections to Uralic-speaking groups rather than Mongolic ones. Haplogroup C2, M217, the defining paternal marker of Mongol and other East Asian steppe nomads, is almost entirely absent in Slavic populations. Even in Russia, where Mongol rule lasted the longest, the frequency of C2, M217 remains below 5% in most regions and is primarily restricted to areas with known Turkic or Siberian ancestry. In contrast, in populations with substantial Mongol ancestry, such as the Buryats and Kalmyks, this haplogroup reaches frequencies of over 50%. The stark difference between these populations and Slavs suggests that Mongol paternal genetic influence on Slavs was minimal. The limited presence of East Asian Y-DNA in Slavs is better explained by historical interactions with Siberian, Turkic, and Finno-Ugric peoples, rather than direct Mongol ancestry. For example, in some northern Russian regions, a small but notable frequency of Y haplogroup N1c, which is more common among Uralic and Siberian groups, is present. However, this does not indicate direct Mongol ancestry, as N1c is not characteristic of Mongolic populations. Historical records further support the genetic findings. The Mongol conquest of Eastern Europe was primarily a military and political occupation rather than a large-scale migration. Unlike in Central Asia and China, where Mongols settled and integrated with local populations, they did not establish large Mongol settlements in Slavic lands. Instead, they ruled indirectly through the tribute system, allowing local Slavic princes to maintain power under Mongol oversight. Moreover, the Mongols practiced strict social and military hierarchies that limited intermarriage with conquered peoples. While Mongol warriors may have taken local women as wives or concubines, their children were often raised within Mongol or Turkic-speaking cultural settings rather than integrating into Slavic populations. Additionally, Slavic societies, particularly in Russia, maintained strong Orthodox Christian traditions, which would have acted as a cultural barrier against large-scale assimilation with Mongols, who followed shamanistic, Buddhist, and later Islamic traditions. If Mongol men had significantly contributed to the Slavic gene pool, we would expect to see more pronounced East Asian physical traits among Slavs today. However, while some Russian populations exhibit minor Asian features, they are far less common than in groups with confirmed Mongol ancestry, such as Kazakhs or Buryats. This further reinforces the genetic evidence that Mongol paternal influence on Slavs was negligible. In conclusion, Y chromosome analysis clearly indicates that Mongol men did not significantly contribute to the Slavic gene pool. The overwhelming dominance of European Y-DNA haplogroups, such as R1A and I2 in Slavs, combined with the near absence of the Mongolic C2 haplogroup, proves that Mongol paternal lineage had little to no lasting genetic impact. While Mongol rule shaped Slavic history, its genetic imprint on Slavic men is virtually